So, hello, my friends. So, I've been thinking recently about how you build a new community. And that's a timely subject to my way of thinking, because if you look at the major kind of indicators that I follow, at least in this futures business, about what's coming downstream, the major kind of stakes in the ground for me, at least, are from 2025 to 2027 when Martin Armstrong says that there's going to be a global civil war, which will be followed closely by the disintegration of the United States of America and presumably a bunch of other countries, and then a reconstitution and reorganization in North America, at least, of about 5 or 6 different new countries by 2032. So what you've got is the whole system comes apart in 2027. And 5 years later, it is reconstituted into a new world, in North America at least. Armstrong says there's no European Union by 2032. But at least in this part of the world, you end up with 5 or 6 new countries. Now, I've played around in government enough to know that the way countries work, or certainly this country works, is very complicated. There are an amazing number of kind of functions that the federal government performs that are hard to understand the complexity if you haven't been inside of it or haven't been close to it. I mean, just little things like the Federal Communications Commission and the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and so on, who coordinate all this aircraft and flying and allow flight following and radar monitoring of flights from one side of the country to the other one. And if you suddenly have the federal government implode, what that means, of course, is that none of the agencies work because they have, I don't know, presumably run out of money. That would be the most common or obvious scenario to me, is that people quit paying their taxes, and reportedly, for what it's worth, something like 30, the amount of taxes that are being collected is down 30% right now. And what that means, of course, is that people smell. It's crowdsourcing the future. They understand and they smell, and so they decide that they're not going to pay into this losing kind of situation. Even if they don't have it that well refined and clear, they realize that the whole thing it's increasingly dysfunctional, and they don't want to be a part of that. And so when you just think about then the interstate kind of relations, and it's, what are the state, one presumes, I guess, it'd be fair to presume that if a series of new countries kind of reconstituted themselves, they'd probably kind of organize themselves around the existing states. So states would, opt in or out of whatever the new organization or the new reconfiguration is. And so that you would have some state governments and you'd have that at least working. But it's the interstate kind of things. When that quits working, then there are all amazing kind of things that happen or don't happen because the federal government isn't there to do it. That's one kind of issue of this whole thing. And the one that's more important and more interesting to me is, how does this everything reconstitute around a new country, let's say, or countries, but a new country, and particularly one that would say represent the principles and the objectives and the values that we're interested in. So you look downstream and you say, if there's going to be a new human and a new world, then however you define world, at least it starts with some local kind of organization, presumably. And then it, moves on from there. It's hard to believe that everybody in North America would suddenly see the light and decide that they were next Thursday morning, that they would see themselves and the world in a whole new way, and that they would cast off the old government and come together commonly around a new set of principles and build a new government within 5 years, right? And so this is a ragged leading edge of this whole thing necessarily. And so I've been trying to think about how would it come together? Let's call it a new community. How would a new community of like-minded people who saw the world in quite a different way, right? Who had a new set of principles and objectives. They would, their whole, the whole. Wait, let's start this way. If you thought that this new world, and let's define the world in terms of your world, like a local area or a regional area. So it would be one of these new countries in North America, because I have no way of knowing how this would work on a global basis at all. But you can kind of start to see how the pieces might come together on a local basis or a regional basis. But what if all of the kind of indications from ancient literature and the spiritual religious documents and things like the Bible and whatever, and all these indigenous groups and everything who talk about essentially in one way or another 1,000 years of peace? That if this is the reorganization period, this 5 years to 2027 to 2032, if that's the reorganization period and you come out of the back end of the thing, hard to believe that the whole world would do this, but let's just say we were going to get a country together ourselves that was going to kind of represent these new principles and these new ideas. What would it look like, and how would you get from here to there? How would that work? This is intriguing because it has the distinct possibility of being real. And, it's one thing in my business to kind of theoretically build scenarios about possibilities and other kinds of things. And you kind of don't really see the path from here to there. I mean, you can build the prerequisite events and so on, but getting them all to line up and to happen, you're necessarily fighting the inertia of the system, which all wants to hold things down and keep it going the way it's going because it's predictable. Everything, it wants predictability essentially, so that you can plan for it. And they don't like chaos or unpredictability or other such things. So if you got that, if that's what's going, you need to start to think a little bit about, what are these principles that would bring a bunch of people together around and encourage them to organize in a hurry and allow them the ability to structure themselves in the systems and such that they would be able to be effective and that they could carry on and make a living and do whatever you need to do. But the tricky thing is that it's in this little mind experiment that we're doing, the tricky part is that none of the stuff that we're familiar with would work the same way. By definition, essentially, because it's going to be a new world. And it's going to be organized and directed towards some new objectives and some new things that are things like everybody kind of gets along with each other. That there is it's 1,000 years of peace after all. So how do you get to 1,000 years of peace? Well, you got to have a bunch of people that all kind of get along with each other, and they help one another. That's an integral kind of part of the mindset that allows something like this to happen, it seems to me. And you'd have a whole new idea of kind of security and economics and other kinds of things here, because it wouldn't be built around competition. It would be built around cooperation. I mean, the sense of competition is what generates at the base of what generates so many of the big problems that we have. This new world almost certainly would have a whole new notion of secrecy, certainly about organized and structured secrecy as it comes from government agencies and things. And so you'd have this kind of open operating space where there was the reason why you could open up secrecy is because you trusted people that they wouldn't take advantage of you in some way or another. So that would have to kind of emerge in this new space, right? In a hurry, within 5 years, right? Something would have to kind of bring folks together or allow folks to come together such that they trusted each other. They were open about what they were interested in. They had a clarity about how they needed to work along with each other. And they had a pretty good idea about where they were going. They had a new idea of how reality worked. Because if you had the same idea about how reality worked, you'd produce the same thing over again, right? And so it's got to this all happens in 5 years, right? So how do you get a new sense of who you are, your sense of self, and this expanded awareness about how reality works and so on? And then in the end of the whole thing is that you clearly war is not on the table. You solve your problems in a dramatically different way. And it has a lot to do with how you value each other and what kind of somewhat simple, I think, but powerful mechanisms that you put in place to do conflict resolution. But anyway, that's kind of the objective. And you come into this thing out of whatever it was that forced and encouraged and enabled this reconfiguration, because it doesn't happen on its own. Absolutely. Everybody, like I say, nobody ever gets up on Thursday. Everybody doesn't get up on some Thursday morning and say, well, let's start a new country. No. As I said, the inertia of the system, it's just trying to keep this whole big, giant, amazingly complex machine keep going straight the same way. And the fact that it is all come apart within 2 years, 2025 to 2027, so much so that within the next 5 years, you reconstitute the United States of America. I mean, it's mind-bogglingly complex if you have any sense at all of how this whole thing works. I mean, it's just wildly complicated. And the notion that it would all, I mean, it's almost like this whirlwind that would come and just blow it all together. And somehow it all kind of came together. And I mean, we don't need to talk about it now, but I mean, kinds of events or catalytic events that would force or encourage this thing. A whole spend an hour just talking about those kind of wild things, because I'm telling you, it's got to be so big that it just drives you back up against the wall and you say, wait a second, we're not doing that anymore. And we're going to do, and it so kind of sears your heart and your guts and your emotions such that everybody just agrees. Yeah, that, nah, never, we're not doing that. And, it's a little bit about like some of those folks who lived through the Depression, right? My grandparents and so on. I remember them talking about some of the things associated with the Depression, and God, that just colors their life for the rest of their life. Well, it's something like that, something big, something really big has to happen. It may well be that this whole notion of betrayal and the fact that people kind of rise up against governments because they feel like they've been really fundamentally betrayed, and not just politicians lying to you all the time. I mean, this is really big structural things. So if that was the kind of the basic kind of notion going into this thing, if you got together a Continental Congress or whatever, you got some folks together and they're going to put together a Articles of Independence or Declaration of Independence or whatever the documents were that you were going to, were going to be the basis for this new organization. What would it be? How would it be? Well, one of the things, almost certainly, going into this space, but you'd have to assume the existence of the internet. If you didn't have the internet, then you're not organizing yourself in 5 years around 5 new countries. It's impossible. If you didn't have the internet, you'd be down in the Stone Age almost, trying to figure out how to just get to tomorrow and find food and whatever. I mean, so the internet exists in this little exercise. And what that means is that you have this extraordinary kind of information, this fabric that connects everybody and gives you the ability that you can bring people together and that you can surface ideas and concepts and other such things in ways that you could never do before. So you start to see the outline of the possibility of how in 5 years this whole thing could reconfigure itself, because the internet would allow the metabolism to work a whole lot faster than anything we've ever seen before, and would allow like-minded people to find each other, and the other kind, and the good ideas to find a home and so on. I mean, I don't need to tell you what you'd do if things went sideways. You'd grab your phone, right? And you'd start going to your search engine. I hope it isn't Google, but anyway, you'd go looking around and you'd try to find like-minded people or other ideas or what was going on or some other kind of thing that's extraordinarily powerful and enabling what the internet will allow and what it can do. And, who knows what will be available in just 2 more years, because the rate of change in this space is just exponential. So the internet is there. We start with the assumption that the internet is there. And you would also have to start with the assumption that none of the things that we took for granted in terms of how we organized ourselves were necessarily valid in this kind of context. That is to say, you certainly wouldn't rebuild the same thing that you just came away from, right? I mean, if you were up against the wall and the world had blown up and you saw this kind of dystopian kind of situation that you were surrounded with, you wouldn't go back and rebuild the whole thing that started it and kept it, that presuming, remember, we're building our own kind of government, or this our own community. And it's around these new ideas and these new concepts. And so we're not going to go just start it all up again. Say the education, we got to build a school so all of the teachers can teach the kids. Well, maybe not. Maybe it works in a different way. And the same thing goes for government. And the same thing goes for security and police and other such things. I mean, you're suddenly open to amazing kind of new ideas or possibilities. And so you're not constrained in ways that you've been in before. And in fact, remember, you're being the pressure behind all of this thing that's driving you into this space is some huge catalytic event that just really torqued the whole situation and scared everyone half to death, or whatever it did, because it forced them all to stand up and say no more of this, and bring down the government, essentially. And so there's something behind. You got to remember that it's kind of this thing behind that's pushing you into this space that's saying, we're not doing this one anymore. We're going to do this again. And then there'd be some enlightened folks who'd say, what an opportunity to rebuild and build a new world in a new way. And that's essentially what you'd try to do, and to bring these people together. This new world would be built around some new principles necessarily. You can make the case that the way our present world runs is all based upon a set of principles that are really dysfunctional or ineffective. The idea that I was reading the other day that every American commits 3 felonies every day, and they don't even know it, because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of rules and laws and other such things, and there's no way in the world that you can know what any of them, what they all are. So you don't know if you're breaking the law in some kind of way, and it essentially provides the government and the law enforcement folks with always with an opportunity that they can find something to throw you into jail if that's what they want to do. And so there'd be new principles. And so I would suggest that one of them would be, as I alluded to earlier, that there would be no secrets, relatively speaking. That essentially you get rid of 90% of them or something like that. My friend Robert David Steele, who spent a goodly part, most of his adult life, trying to reorganize the whole kind of intelligence business and around open source. He essentially said the idea of secrecy, which, by the way, just colors everything inside of the FBI and the DOD and the CIA and the who you name them, the 3-letter agencies. The whole thing is about secrecy. It's just layered. If you've never been in there, you don't even begin to understand what I mean, because everything is about keeping the secret from whoever it is, the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else. And so if you so what Robert figured out was, or he went around saying, is that there was only probably, well, I can't remember his number, 2 to 5% or something like that of the intelligence that is required in order to run a government and maintain security and other such things. And 95% of it is out in open sources, and there's no need for the 95% of the secrets that everybody's keeping all the time, and a goodly portion of which are kept because they're threatened politically and otherwise. And so if you suddenly had a switch and you went to kind of know secrets, what it would do would unleash a huge amount of creativity and innovation, because there would be all kinds of things that had suddenly become available in terms of, obvious stuff like energy development, production, and so on, that have been kept under wraps. It's been estimated by those who know something about this that by the time something that's been classified, deeply classified, finally makes it up into the white world, where it becomes apparent and obvious that they've been doing this stuff, it's 70 years. They've had it under the table, working it, applying it different kind of places for 70 years, and that's a lifetime that nobody knows what they've been doing until they decide that it's time to bring it to the surface. And when that happens, believe me, they've already got something else in place to take over from that. So when stealth aircraft suddenly become obvious, that technology is around for 70 years, and they've been using it for all other kind of things. So you get this explosion of innovation and ideas and knowledge and stuff. And so that would help, accelerate this whole thing and make it work in about 5 years to reorganize itself. There would be, like I said, you'd have this kind of fundamental structural notion of cooperation rather than competition. A goodly number of us, I don't know. I don't live in other people's families, so I really don't know. But I was about to say most families kind of get along in one way or another. They don't compete with each other in quite the same way that other parts of the society do. But again, all I can tell you is from my family and the things that I'm familiar with. And what I know is that it's really quite possible to live in an environment where it's trusting and you get along and so on. And so question is kind of how would you get into that kind of thing? Of course, like I said, you would have a whole new kind of ways in which you do conflict resolution at all different kind of levels. And it may be, I've had the idea for a long time that this new world would be built around, I'd guess, probably 6, 7, 8 at the most, kind of basic principles. Things like you can do anything that you want as long as you don't hurt anybody else. You should do, the golden rule, do to others as you'd like to be treated yourself. There's a handful, at best, there's a handful of these kind of really basic structural concepts that if we kind of structured them and made them an integral part of how this society worked, that you taught kids from the time that they were very young that this is the way it works. This is how you treat people. This is the operating kind of principles of how it works. Then it becomes obvious that that's how you deal with every situation in life. Becomes a roundabout. It's not a traffic light that tells you to stop here and wait till the government tells you it's time to go. It's a traffic circle that everybody knows what the rules is, and you look and watch the people coming around from the left-hand side until you find a hole, and then you go in. And it all works because everybody knows what the rules are. You don't have to need some outside kind of source to tell you that, which is an example I've used many times in the past. And so there is, if you taught kids that way, if it was an integral part, if it's a central part of the curriculum of growing up, then they would see themselves and they'd see the world in a whole different kind of way. What you'd also have to do is teach young people how to think. Education would be about how to make sense out of things themselves, how to evaluate and so on, and how to question the whole system. The issue would be not about kind of memorizing and read me back what what I told you so that you can pass a test or a quiz. It's more about the answer is things like why. Why does this work the way it's working? How does this what's going on here? And if you had that and everybody worked in those kinds of things, then it'd dramatically shape everything else. You'd have to have new laws and new regulations in this new world. You'd have to get rid of all of the old kinds of stuff, and you know, maybe if you were lucky, you'd have that many laws. I don't know. I haven't thought about it, but there are some things that people need to know beforehand, what they should or shouldn't do because they don't know. They wouldn't know otherwise. And so therefore it defines. And so there's some kind of things where you need some outside kind of input that gives you some direction and where the boundaries are and so on. But it's nothing like it is now. And so you need these new laws and regulations. What you would almost certainly have in this new world, and this is the thing that would allow it to happen, would be a new energy source, that where you could generate electricity, and you wouldn't be dependent upon centralized power generating system and government regulated and other kinds of things. Essentially, the communications has got to be open, the energy has got to be open, and and information has to be open. And if you do that, then what you do is inform and you allow and you empower individuals to rise to the occasion because you've given them all of the kinds of stuff that they can use and what they need in order to really play in this new space in the best way possible. And what you also need is you'd have to have, and this is another place where the internet would particularly work and they'd be important, is that you'd have to build these new communities. You'd have to build a new sense of community. It's not so much a new sense of community as a new structure and mechanism and operation of community. There would have to be some way in which people who were not living adjacent to you, neighbors, where you could reach out and interact, and the whole thing could work like a little town, like where I live in Berkeley Springs. 600 people, and a lot of them, or many of them, most of them, and you know who to talk to and what to do and how to do that. How do you do that in, for 10,000 or some other kind of thing, and around these new ideas and so on, which raises an interesting question about how much of this new world is virtual rather than kind of physical, because it may well be that in this new space, because you can almost guarantee that there'd be some new technology that software in particular that would show up into this space that would enable this to all come together and for you to find like-minded people. And it's really qualitatively different than today. You can find like-minded people all over the world who are interested, and you can have a chat room or some other kind of thing, but that's not a community in the terms that what I'm talking about, and the requirement and the need to have all this interdependence and all this function and this cross-fertilization and value transfer and all of the things that that come from people interacting personally and really with people in real time kind of space. But of course, it could be some amalgam. It can be some synthetic form that emerged that again uses the huge kind of leverage of the internet, but also somehow, particularly in the face of all of these deep fakes and other kinds of things, got somebody on the other side of you. At least you can look in their eye across the table and you know that you thought you were looking at a real person anyway. So anyway, it's going to be a very, very interesting time. And it is going to raise all kinds of kind of intrinsic threats to the status quo. Yeah, and cracks in the facade and the defense of the present system that is going to let a lot of light in and allow you to kind of move out into a new space. And if you think about it in terms of the kind of the major kind of ideas that we all know about in terms of the structure and the organization of the United States, a country like the United States, then what you know is that you would just really have to do this well. Whoever was, providing leadership in this kind of space, so it'd have humongous, a huge amount of responsibility to it's nothing less than restructuring a new world or a new country, right? That could then turn into, the seed for the whole new world. And so you'd really have to really think very hard and get some very, very good people together to, in the same way that the founding fathers, if you ever spend much time looking into that stuff, those were smart guys. I mean, you can take issue with any number of things about their personal lives, but let me tell you, though, that was very, very sophisticated and very deep and complex thinking that went into that. And so we'd have to do, something like that. That would be a part of all of this. But in any case, it's an amazing opportunity that just nobody else, and not even in your lifetime, in the whole history, kind of has had a chance like we do to be able to put something like this together. And so it's fascinating to think about it, and sure, it can be the basis of an interesting follow-on discussion.